Hands where we can see them now. The voice of the Coast Guard shattered the morning calm, cutting into the quiet fishing trip of an old fisherman named Elijah Carter. But as they tore through his humble boat, they had no idea who they were facing. They didn't know the quiet strength he carried, or the promise he'd made to a fallen brother so many years ago. And when a decorated captain arrived, the truth of Elijah's past began to surface, one quiet moment at a time. This is a story of quiet resilience, of honor that can't be stolen. Stay with us. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The first light of dawn brushed the edges of the sky, painting the waters of Jacksonville, Florida, in a soft, golden glow. Elijah Carter, 79 years old, eased his weathered hands along the rail of the small dock, feeling the salt-laden breeze on his face. He'd been coming here every morning for as long as anyone could remember, carrying with him nothing but a thermos of coffee and the gentle weight of memories. His boat, the Evelyn, rocked slightly with the tide, a modest wooden vessel, painted a faded white that had once been bright, named after his wife who'd passed 8 years before. He still spoke to her sometimes, his voice low and steady, as if the sea itself would carry those words to where she was waiting. Elijah liked the quiet of these hours, the way the seagulls gathered, calling softly as if they were old friends checking in. The gentle slap of water against the hull, steady and sure, was a rhythm that matched the beat of his heart. Inside the small cabin of the Evelyn, a single photograph was pinned above the worn dash. Black and white, edges curling. It showed a young Elijah in uniform. Beside him stood Raymond Cole, his friend and comrade, smiling in the dust and chaos of a long-ago war. Sometimes, when the mornings were still and the coffee was just right, Elijah would touch that photograph. He'd let his fingers rest on the image of Raymond's face, remembering the way the man laughed even when the world was on fire, remembering the promise he had made when Raymond fell, a promise that lived in his bones still. "I'll keep it alive," Elijah would murmur to the sea. "I won't let anyone forget." And then he'd start the engine, the old wood creaking but never complaining. The Evelyn drifted out into deeper water, guided by a steady hand and a mind that had seen enough storms to know how to ride them out. Elijah baited his hook slowly, his movements precise, almost reverent. Fishing wasn't just a pastime, it was a prayer, a way to quiet the noise of a world that moved too fast. He didn't own a cell phone. He didn't watch the news. He found enough in the rise of the sun and the patient sweep of the tide. On this morning, and the sky was clear, the horizon wide and empty. But even as he cast his line and settled into the soft rhythm of waiting, something in the air felt different, a tension he couldn't name, like the sea itself had paused to listen. It started as a low rumble, distant but growing. Elijah turned his head, eyes narrowing against the glare of the rising sun. A Coast Guard cutter was cutting through the calm, engines loud, wake frothing white behind it. He watched it approach, no alarm in his gaze, only the quiet curiosity of a man who had seen much and feared little. The cutter drew close enough that its hull loomed high over the Evelyn, shadow falling across the deck. Salt spray licked at his face, cold and bracing. Then the loudspeaker crackled to life, the voice of authority slicing through the morning stillness. "Hands where we can see them, sir," ordered a young man in a sharp uniform, his voice tense with the weight of the moment. Petty Officer Jason Miller, nameplate glinting in the sun, stared down from the deck above. Elijah moved slowly, as if even this sudden intrusion couldn't break the calm he carried like a second skin. He raised his hands, palms outward, showing the empty honesty of a man who had nothing to hide. His eyes met Miller's, steady as the sea. 3 armed officers jumped down onto the Evelyn's deck, boots slamming hard against the worn planks. They fanned out, rifles at the ready, the sharp scent of gun oil cutting through the salt air. Not a word of explanation, not a flicker of doubt in their eyes. One of them knocked over his tackle box, sending hooks and lures skittering across the boards like startled minnows. Another shoved aside the small cooler where he kept his bait, the soft thud of it lost in the rush of blood and breath. Elijah didn't move. He only watched. In the quiet of his mind, another voice stirred a memory wrapped in gunpowder and dust. He was back in the jungle, night pressing close, the whump of mortars a steady drumbeat. Raymond's voice, low and fierce, in the darkness beside him. "We hold the line, brother," Raymond had said, blood on his lips in a grin that cut through the fear. "No matter what. We don't let them break it." Elijah had promised then, a promise that lived in the marrow of his bones. Now, decades later, that promise was a quiet echo in his chest. As the agents tore through his belongings, he felt no anger, no panic, only the steady certainty of a man who had already survived worse. Petty Officer Miller stepped closer, eyes narrowed. He was young, eager, the kind of man who saw enemies in every shadow. "Sir, we have a report," he said, voice clipped. "Possible smuggling, contraband. We need to search everything." Elijah nodded once, the motion small, dignified. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He knew the truth of who he was, and that was enough. The young man didn't like the silence. He pushed harder, words like bullets. "You understand, don't you? We can't take chances." Elijah met his gaze, calm and unshaken. "I understand," he said, his voice a soft rumble, like the sea against the rocks. And then he lowered his eyes, letting them do what they thought they must. Inside his chest, the words of his old friend rose up like a vow. "I will not let them take our honor." A quiet prayer, a quiet promise, as the sun rose higher and the waves rocked the Evelyn like a cradle. The search went on. Boots tramped over the boards, over memories, over the soft places of a life lived quietly and well. But Elijah stood still, a lone figure in the morning light, hands lifted not in surrender, but in silent, steady faith, because he had already learned, long ago, that some things couldn't be taken by force, not by weapons, not by suspicion, not even by fear. And this morning, on the waters of Jacksonville, he would prove it again. The sun had climbed higher now, painting the water in shifting shades of gold and blue. But on the deck of the Evelyn, the air felt tight, heavy with unspoken questions and silent accusations. Petty Officer Jason Miller's voice rang out, sharp and cold. "Search everything," he ordered, his hand cutting through the air like a blade. The other agents moved without hesitation, opening compartments, overturning boxes, pulling up every plank they could find. Hooks and bobbers clattered across the floor, the bright plastic tumbling like lost memories. Elijah watched them work, his expression calm, almost gentle. The hands that had mended nets and baited hooks for decades now rested quietly at his sides. He did not flinch when they knocked over the small frame photo of Evelyn, the glass cracking as it hit the floor. Agent Walters, the youngest of the crew, let out a low, mocking laugh. "An old man with an old boat," he said, voice dripping with skepticism. "Can't fool me. There's always something rotten hiding beneath the calm." The words rolled off Elijah like water off the hull. He turned his gaze to the horizon, letting the boy's suspicion fade into the sea air. He had nothing to prove to men who didn't know what it meant to stand in silence. His mind drifted back, unbidden, to a different dawn so many years ago. The ground had shuddered with the weight of mortar fire, smoke coiling thick as a living thing. He could still hear the thump of boots in wet jungle mud, the staccato crack of rifles, the low grunt of men fighting to stay alive. Khe-Sanh. The name tasted like blood and dust in his mouth. Even now, he had been just a boy in a uniform then, his hands shaking around a battered M16 heart pounding like a war drum. Beside him, Raymond Cole had stood tall, eyes bright even in the darkness. Raymond, with his easy grin and the quiet courage that never wavered, even when the world seemed to end around them. They had fought side by side, brothers in arms, bound by something deeper than orders or duty. Raymond, Elijah had said in a low voice, as they huddled behind a half-broken wall, shrapnel singing in the air. If I make it out of this, I swear to you, I'll live for all of us. And Raymond, with blood on his hands and laughter in his eyes, had nodded. That's the only way, Raymond had replied, the words a soft promise in the roar of chaos. Live like it matters. Live like you remember. Then he had gone over the wall, into the fire, and Elijah had never seen him again. Now, decades later, the deck of the Evelyn felt like another battlefield, not of bullets and bombs, but of suspicion and careless power. But Elijah stood the same way he had then, unmoving, unbroken, his silence a shield stronger than any weapon. Petty Officer Miller's boots thudded across the boards, eyes sharp and restless. He moved to the small compartment near the helm, fingers prying at the latch with impatient force. When it opened, a few slips of paper tumbled out: Elijah's fishing license, boat registration, nothing more. Miller snatched them up, flipping through them with a frown. Just paperwork, he muttered, though his voice held no relief. He was the kind of man who didn't trust what he couldn't break. Elijah watched him, eyes steady and quiet. There was no fear in his gaze, no anger. He had seen too much to be rattled by suspicion alone. The young agent, Walters, leaned closer, peering over Miller's shoulder. "Nothing here," he said, almost disappointed. But Miller's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. "There's always something," Miller said softly, his voice a warning. He turned back to Elijah, eyes narrow, searching. "You're out here alone every morning. Why? Who pays you to be here?" Elijah's lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile that never reached his eyes. "No one pays me," he said, voice calm and sure. "I'm just a man who loves the sea." Miller didn't like that answer. He wanted fear, or anger, or a crack in the quiet armor Elijah wore so easily. But Elijah had no cracks left. He had learned, in the red haze of the jungle and the long years after, that the strongest men were those who did not need to shout, that the truest answers were the ones that didn't need to be spoken at all. And so he stood there, letting Miller's suspicion wash over him like a wave that would break and be gone. In his mind, the voice of Raymond Cole rose again, a quiet vow echoing through the years. Live like it matters. Elijah had carried that vow through every sunrise, every quiet dawn on the water. He would not let the careless search of strangers take it from him now. The sea rocked gently beneath the Evelyn, as if it, too, understood the weight of silence. The tide pulled and pushed, steady as a heartbeat, while the agents moved through the boat. They found nothing of value, no weapons, no secrets, only the small comforts of a man who had chosen a simple life. The cracked photograph of Evelyn, the neat coils of rope, the battered tackle box. Yet still, Miller's suspicion clung to the air like smoke. He stared at Elijah, eyes cold, voice clipped. "You're too calm," he said. "Men who are innocent usually protest. Why don't you?" Elijah's eyes didn't waver. "Because I have nothing to prove to you," he said simply. "Truth doesn't need to shout." For a moment, the deck felt quiet. Even Walter shifted, unease flickering across his young face. But Miller only scowled, the need to be right coiling in his gut. He took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "We received a tip," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable a stone. "Illegal arms, hidden on a boat matching this description, at this exact time and place." Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew the truth, and he knew it was enough. In the distance, a gull cried out, its voice high and lonely. The sea answered with the hush of waves against wood, and Elijah Carter stood there, a quiet figure in the morning light, waiting for the storm to pass, because he had learned long ago that the only fight worth waging was the one that left your honor intact. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could never be taken. The search had reached a quiet lull. the deck scattered with tools and memories. When the radio crackled to life, a voice, firm and steady, cut through the morning air. All units, cease your search. Secure your positions. Command authority inbound. Petty Officer Jason Miller froze, his eyes darting to the small radio clipped to his vest. Walters shifted uneasily, glancing from Miller to the calm figure of Elijah. For a moment, the deck seemed to hold its breath. Miller's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on the radio. Command, confirm your last. Over, the voice returned. Calm and absolute. Confirmed. Petty Officer. Captain Daniel Cole is en route. Stand by for his arrival. The words dropped into the silence like stones into deep water. Miller swallowed hard, the fight in his shoulders faltering. Elijah said nothing. He watched the young man's face pale, watched the restless energy slip from his fingers. He had seen it before in jungles and deserts, in the eyes of boys sent to do men's work. Then the deep thrum of rotor blades rolled across the water. A helicopter swept in low, wind from its passage tugging at the flags and whipping the sea into whitecaps. It hovered a moment, then dipped to land on the small strip of grass by the dock. The hatch opened, and a figure stepped down, boots sinking into the wet earth with quiet finality. Captain Daniel Cole stood tall, his uniform sharp and clean even in the salt air. He moved with a calm authority that didn't need to raise its voice. Jason Miller's breath quickened, the weight of rank heavy on his shoulders. He glanced at Walters, who shifted closer, uncertainty clouding the young man's features. Elijah watched them both, a still point in the gathering storm. Daniel Cole's eyes swept the scene, taking in the agents, the upturned gear, and finally Elijah standing steady on the deck. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, measured. His gaze met Elijah's, and for a moment, the years fell away. Elijah Carter, he said, voice low and clear. My father spoke of you often. Raymond Cole, you were his brother in arms. The words carried a weight beyond the morning's confusion. Miller shifted uncomfortably, but Daniel didn't spare him a glance. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. Edges worn, colors faded, but the face is still clear. Raymond Cole, grinning beneath a battered helmet, one arm slung around a younger Elijah. The jungle rising dark, entangled behind them, the gleam of determination in their eyes. Daniel held it up, his fingers careful on the fragile paper. My father kept this, he said quietly. He told me that if I ever found you again, I should remember what you gave to him, to all of us. His voice didn't waver, but there was a softness beneath the authority. Elijah looked at the photograph, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He was a good man, he said softly, and he kept his word, even when the world forgot. Daniel's eyes flickered, the steel softening for just a breath. Then he turned to Miller, his expression cooling like a blade drawn from the forge. Petty Officer Miller, he said, each syllable precise. Miller swallowed, his voice catching. Sir, we had intel. A tip about this vessel. Daniel cut him off with a look, sharp and unwavering. You had suspicion, he said, voice calm but edged. But what you forgot was the foundation of that uniform you wear: respect. For those who served before you, for the quiet debt we owe them all. Miller's mouth opened, then closed. The deck seemed to shrink around him, the weight of those words pressing down. Walters shifted again, his eyes dropping to the deck in shame. Daniel took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving Miller's. This man, he said, gesturing to Elijah, is not your suspect. He is the reason my father came home. He is the reason I stand here today, in this uniform, carrying the name Cole with pride. His voice didn't rise, but it carried with it the force of memory and promise. Miller's face went pale, his shoulders stiff. Sir, I didn't know, he said hoarsely. I didn't understand. Daniel's gaze sharpened, the quiet fury of a man who had seen enough to know what mattered. Then understand this, he said. Respect is not optional. It is the debt we pay for the freedom we wear like a badge. A silence fell, thick and heavy. Elijah stood still, his hands resting lightly on the rail of the Evelyn. He did not demand apology. He did not need to. But Daniel turned fully to Miller, his jaw set. "You will apologize," he said softly, the finality of it like the closing of a door. "Right here, right now, in front of Mr. Carter, and in front of the memory of every man who never made it home." Miller's throat worked, his lips parting around words that didn't want to come. But under Daniel's steady gaze, there was no room for refusal, no space for pride or deflection. I, I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't understand what I was doing." Each word landed heavy in the quiet morning. Elijah looked at the young man, his face calm, eyes holding a kindness that did not excuse but did not condemn. He gave a single, small nod, the gesture as steady as the tide. And in that moment, something shifted on the deck. Daniel stepped closer to Elijah, his voice softening. "My father owed you his life," he said, "and I owe you my gratitude." He handed the photograph to Elijah, the paper warm from his hand. "For you," he said quietly. "From him." Elijah took it, the lines of his face softening around a memory that had never faded. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of decades. "Your father was a good man, and so are you." Daniel nodded once, a deep breath easing the tension in his shoulders. He turned back to the agents, his voice calm but unyielding. "Reset the deck. Return everything as you found it. Then stand down." They moved quickly, carefully now, the careless force of earlier replaced by quiet hands and bowed heads. The tackle box was righted, the photograph of Evelyn placed gently back on the dash. Elijah watched them, his silence a benediction, because in that moment, he understood honor wasn't something that could be taken by suspicion or fear. It was something that lived in the quiet acts of those who remembered, and those who chose to see. Jason Miller stood there, shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the deck beneath his feet. The weight of his mistake pressed into every word he struggled to say. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," he finally managed, his voice catching in his throat. "I forgot what men like you gave up, what you carried home in silence." His face flushed with shame, and his hands twitched at his sides, as if he didn't know where to put them anymore. The morning light painted his face in harsh relief, the apology trembling but real. Elijah Carter met his gaze without anger, his eyes steady as the sea around them. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence settle, letting the words breathe. Then he gave a single, small nod, the motion gentle, like the shifting of the tide. "No need for words beyond that," he said softly, his voice a calm echo of the waves. "There's no shame in learning, only in refusing to learn." And with that, he released the boy from the weight of his guilt. Miller let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stood a little straighter, the color in his face returning, and in that moment, the deck seemed to grow a little quieter, the tension melting away like morning fog. Captain Daniel Cole stepped closer to Elijah, his movements deliberate, respectful. The memory of his father lingered in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders squared when he spoke. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low but sure. "Would you mind if I joined you for a while today?" Elijah tilted his head, a flicker of surprise dancing behind the calm in his gaze. "You want to fish?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Daniel nodded once, his answer simple and earnest. "I would," he said, "to understand a little better, and to honor my father's memory with you." It wasn't a demand or an order, just a quiet request that spoke of something deeper. Elijah considered the younger man for a moment. Then he reached into the small tackle box, pulling out an old rod with worn cork grips. He held it out to Daniel, the gesture soft but steady. "This was Evelyn's rod," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of 1,000 dawns on the water. "She always said the fish liked it best, Let's see if that still holds true. Daniel accepted it with both hands, reverence in the way his fingers closed around the wood. That, with a slow breath, he reached into his breast pocket. From it, he drew a small, time-worn patch and insignia of the unit his father had once served. He held it out, the edges frayed, the colors muted by years. "My father would want you to have this," Daniel said softly. "It's a piece of his life, a piece of the promise he made to you out there." His voice caught for just a second, but he didn't look away. Elijah took it carefully, feeling the rough weave beneath his fingertips. Memories washed over him like the hush of the tide Quezon, the laughter and the fear, the bonds forged in fire. "Raymond never let me down," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "And I won't let this be forgotten, either." They stood together on the deck for a moment, the patch between them a bridge across years and memories. Then Elijah turned to the water, his movements measured, his shoulders loose with the peace of a man who knew his place in the world. He baited his line with the same slow care he'd always used, each motion a prayer of patience. Daniel watched him, the fishing rod in his hand feeling both familiar and new. He cast his line in a practiced motion, the weight of the sinker cutting through the morning calm. The water took the offering with a quiet ripple, the circles widening, then fading into stillness. The two men fished in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the hull and the low murmur of the waves. There was no need for words. The act itself was enough, a shared rhythm, a quiet bond that asked nothing but presence. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel leaned back against the rail, eyes on the horizon. He thought of the stories his father had told him, of the nights he'd spent wondering if he could ever live up to them. And he realized, standing there beside Elijah, that it wasn't about matching the past, it was about carrying it forward. Elijah reeled in slowly, the lines shimmering in the light. The hook came up empty, but he only smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Sometimes it's not about the catch," he said. "Sometimes it's about the quiet and what it lets you remember." Daniel nodded, feeling those words settle deep. He glanced back at the tackle box, at the photograph of Raymond tucked safely inside, a reminder that some debts were paid not with money or medals, but with quiet mornings like this. As the day began to lean toward afternoon, they kept fishing, each cast a thread weaving the past and present together. The water glistened in the sun, the soft hush of waves, a comfort that asked for nothing more than respect. And standing there, Daniel knew he had found what he didn't even know he was searching for. Eventually, Elijah set his rod down, stretching his back with a slow, deliberate ease. He turned to Daniel, his gaze soft but clear. "Thank you," he said simply, "not for today, but for remembering what matters." Daniel met his eyes, feeling the quiet weight of that gratitude. "It's my honor," he said, and he meant it. Then he took up his rod again, casting once more into the endless blue. The sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows stretching long across the deck. The breeze carried the scent of salt and memory, each breath a reminder of what had been won and what had been lost. And in that space between past and present, the gentle rhythm of the tide spoke the only truth they needed. Honor never fades. It simply waits, quiet and patient, for those who know how to hold it. And on the deck of the Evelyn, in the last light of the day, that truth lived and breathed in every cast, every ripple, every breath of the sea. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.